I'd like to take a moment to thank listener and patron HI for submitting the History of Cyprus podcast for the 2026 Cyprus Diaspora Forum nomination in the Culture and Arts category, which is now entering its third year. CYDIA is an initiative that highlights innovation and cultural contribution across the Cypriot diaspora, with categories ranging from education and health to culture and arts. It's important to clarify that this submission does not mean the History of Cyprus podcast has been officially nominated. Official nominees are selected later, and those shortlisted are then voted on. That said, the more submissions a project receives, the more likely it is to be shortlisted. Being recognized by CYDIA would be a meaningful opportunity to bring the History of Cyprus podcast and Cypriot history to a wider audience and highlight stories that often go unheard. If you're able to support by submitting a nomination before the March deadline, it would be incredibly appreciated. Information is in this episode's description. And now on to Cypro-Minoan with Cassandra Donnelly.
Cassandra Donnelly is a scholar of ancient writing systems who completed her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in Aegean scripts and Semitic languages. She recently published her first monograph, Cypro-Minoan and its writers, through Cambridge University. Her work focuses on writing and trade in the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, and she collaborates on several international projects analyzing inscriptions, pot marks, and container marks from ancient Cyprus. She is currently a postdoctoral researcher with ERC-funded Compass, that is commercial project across the sea, at the University of Cyprus, and is here to discuss the still yet undeciphered and enigmatic script, the Cypro-Minoan writing systems in Cyprus. Cassie, if I may, welcome to the History of Cyprus podcast.
Hi, Andreas. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Hey, I'm definitely excited for this. I've been looking forward to this for a while. Before we dive into it, I just want to commend you on a very accessible book, The Cypro-Minoan and its writers. What I really appreciated as I was reading it is that you drew comparisons to English, which made your book very readable and very relatable. You were looking at fonts in modern English to compare the problems in deciphering Cypro-Minoan. And I really appreciated that. It makes it so readable.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear that. It was very much with a broad readership in mind that I wrote the book. So as we discussed briefly before we started, I've been living on Cyprus on and off for 5 years now. And I find that people are really interested in what I do, but very few people know anything about Cypro-Minoan. It's just not taught in school. It's not nearly as popular as its Iron Age counterpart, the Cypro-Syllabic script. So when I was writing the book, I really had in mind the people who I met and continue to meet here who have a lot of enthusiasm when I tell them about what I do, but just, we're not taught anything about it. So I'm really happy to hear.
Yeah, no, and this is really true. I mean, speaking from my experience, I've only really started to understand what Cypro-Minoan was just a couple of years ago. Now, you start your book by writing, and I have a quote here, "Only through Cypro-Minoan can we reconstruct how traders used and disseminated writing, including the early form of our own alphabet during the volatile collapse period," end quote. Now, without jumping too far ahead, and we will contextualize everything, what is it that you meant by that opening quote?
So the alphabet as we know it, as many of you probably know, derives from what's referred to as the Phoenician alphabet. And the precursor to that alphabet is referred to as the Proto-Canaanite alphabet. And we have that script attested in the late Bronze Age, in the periods preceding the so-called late Bronze Age collapse. So that's made famous by Eric Klein's book, sometimes referred to as 1177 BCE. That's the time period that we're talking about. And then the Proto-Canaanite alphabet, so the precursor to the precursor of our own, kind of goes missing in the archaeological record for a couple centuries, and then it pops back up with real strength around, let's say, 1,000, or even maybe a little bit before that. And then, in the year 800 BCE, 700 BCE, let's say, we start to see the Phoenician alphabet again. We see it starting to spread. We have alphabetic writing discovered in Pithecusae in Italy, Methone in Greece, and, we're off and running. And there's kind of that gap, right? So we don't know how the spread of the alphabet goes from sort of before the collapse, up and running in small amounts, to this situation or explosion of the alphabet, the 8th century, sometime around there. The reason why we have a gap in that record is not particularly well understood. So we don't know if it's because the alphabet was being used on perishable materials that just get destroyed. That's sort of the hypothesis. But whatever the reason is, we don't understand exactly how the alphabet spread and why it spread so quickly during that period. Where Cypro-Minoan comes into this story is that during those years, so in that 12th century, instead of a gap, we have an explosion of writing on Cyprus. And so one of the reasons that Cypro-Minoan is really interesting to me, and one of the things that I discuss in the book, is that we can look at Cypro-Minoan and the fact that during this period, which otherwise sees the loss or disappearance of different writing systems and an alphabet that's really hard to trace. In the case of Cypro-Minoan, we have a lot of evidence to work with. And because Cypro-Minoan was used in the context of overseas trade, Cypro-Minoan becomes a good way to follow or track how a writing system spreads.
So when was Cypro-Minoan first discovered?
Yeah, so Cypro-Minoan is discovered in the late 19th century. So during the British excavations of Encomi is more or less when we have the first Cypro-Minoan inscriptions. And they were just found on these small clay balls, sometimes referred to with the French word boule, so B-O-U-L-E. And the recognition that the script was somehow connected to linear A, but not identical with it, was pretty immediate. And the reason for that is, while there's definitely an overlap in the sign forms, so the signs in both scripts look like one another, and some are indeed identical. So, more or less the exact same sign. Others aren't. And that recognition was pretty quick.
Mm-hmm. So why was it then coined Cypro-Minoan? And, who made that sort of connection?
So the first person to refer to the script as Cypro-Minoan is Sir Arthur Evans. And he was famous for his role in the publication and popularization of the linear A and linear B script on mainland Greece. For a long time, he was said to be the person who, quote, discovered linear A and linear B, but we kind of now know that villagers in the area of Knossos themselves had already known about the script and alerted local people of interest and even archaeologists to the site of Knossos and to the script already. So it was Evans who, having been exposed to linear A and linear B at Knossos really quite recently to when Cypro-Minoan is discovered, who first makes that identification or that connection.
So just to clarify here for my own sake. So we're talking about the same Arthur Evans who discovered Knossos in Crete, who gave the name of the Minoan civilization. He wasn't in Cyprus. I mean, these clay balls that were excavated in Cyprus were brought to his attention. Am I to understand that correctly?
That's exactly right. Right. So one person that worked closely with Evans and in his orbit is J.L. Myers, so John Lyndon Myers. So he's interesting for his sort of activities working for the British Empire during World War I. He had the nickname the Blackbeard of the Aegean, which I think is sort of hilarious. But he was also a very involved archaeologist on Cyprus as well as Greece. And so I don't know if we have exact documentation of this, but to me it makes a lot of sense that Myers, who we know was on Cyprus, and in fact was responsible for discovering the earliest Cypro-Minoan inscription, which was actually discovered in the 1870s, but it was misidentified, or it was identified as a Cypro-syllabic, so the Iron Age script. So I imagine it's through Myers, who ended up inheriting Evans's material later in life.
So, Cassie, why was it coined Cypro-Minoan? Is that an erroneous comparison, or are there foundations and roots in the Minoan civilization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, at different periods in the history of Cypro-Minoan, the extent of the connection to Crete has been interrogated, and some people have even suggested that the name itself is maybe not useful in the way that it makes Cyprus out to be, or its script out to be, entirely dependent on Linear A or the Minoan civilization. So for those of your listeners who don't know, Linear A is one of two main scripts that were used by the people who are the Minoans, essentially. So the people whose culture is associated with the Minoan culture. And that script was used on the island of Crete from about 1950 BCE until around 1450 or 1400, and sort of its latest periods of time. And so it's really hard to say whether or not there's roots in the Minoan civilization, putting that word in quotation marks, in as much as often I think when we think of cultures, we think of complexes of ideas, languages, worship of God, so on and so forth. And the only thing that I'm really equipped to talk about is the script. And we do think for sure that Cypro-Minoan does borrow a set of its signs from Linear A. And the number of signs borrowed might be as low as 10 or 11 and as high as 30. And that's out of some 80 plus Cypro-Minoan signs. So there's definitely a borrowing. There was definitely interaction between people on Cyprus and people on Crete. Whether or not that interaction took place on Crete or in the Cyclades or on Cyprus is something we can maybe talk about later if you like. But I think we can feel fairly confident that because there's kind of an overlap in the borrowing, but that overlap is not total, that beyond the shapes of the signs, nothing else really makes its way to Cyprus in terms of the language that Linear A encoded. And while it's possible that some of the sounds encoded by the signs, so the phonology does get passed along, we don't know if that was fairly complete or not complete.
Yeah. So let's talk about what we do know about Cypro-Minoan. To begin with, can we identify what type of script it was? For example, do we know it was syllabary or logographic?
Sure. So with confidence, we can say that the Cypro-Minoan script is likely to be a syllabary. And so by a syllabary, we mean that each sign encodes a consonant sound and a vowel sound. So like ba, pa, mi, mo, kind of like that. And similar to how Japanese works today, for instance. And that there was probably a set of vowel sounds or vowel signs, so that don't have a consonant attached. So simple vowel sounds.
Sorry, can I just interject here for a second? My understanding was that vowel sounds in script was only introduced with the Greek alphabet. Does this mean that this is, this predates, obviously it would, it predates the Greek alphabet?
So this definitely predates the Greek alphabet. And I will say that there's something of a confusion maybe in the way that people talk about the innovation of vowels in the Phoenician alphabet by the Greeks. So on the one hand, the statement that you're saying is true in the context of the Phoenician alphabet. So the Phoenician alphabet had limited vowel signs. So aleph is already in the Phoenician alphabet. So alpha, equivalent to Greek alpha. But there's an argument that it wasn't used as a vowel because it was what's referred to as a glottal stop. So like for British people, the glottal stop is sort of where you get rid of that P and instead you kind of close your throat and restrict air. So that's referred, that's thought of as a consonant. So what you're saying is true when you kind of make the statement more narrow, right? So the Greek alphabet innovates vowels with respect to, or in its borrowing and adaptation of the Phoenician alphabet.
Right. Okay. I understand that. So within the context of the Phoenician alphabet, that doesn't mean that vowel sounds didn't exist in other scripts, as we can see in Cypro-Minoan.
Yeah. And, you know, and you can say vowel signs, right? So vowel sounds have always existed. They're part of language.
Right.
But yeah, so exactly. And, you know, even Ugaritic, which is an alphabetic cuneiform script that exists at the same time as Cypro-Minoan, so around, let's say 1250 BCE is when they're coexisting for a good 50 years. The Ugaritic script has signs for an A, an E, and an U, and those signs don't get adapted into the Phoenician alphabet, or you know, the Phoenician alphabet is sort of on a different trajectory. So for sure, different scripts have vowel signs, and that includes, for instance, linear B. So linear B has 5 vowel signs: A, E, I, O, U.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I would assume that there's many out there like me. I'm not a linguist. I consume this history through like sort of a pop culture lens, so to speak. I like watching documentaries, and a lot of the time, that's kind of the impression I got, that the vowel sound is the vowel script is an innovative addition in the Greek alphabet, full stop. And I appreciate the clarification that it is not a quote unquote Greek innovation. It is a Greek innovation in terms of using the Phoenician alphabet, but it exists in different scripts. And this is like a mind blown moment for me, because I genuinely did not know that.
Amazing. Yeah, no, happy to assist. And, you know, one of the things that I talk about in the book, and that is very much true about this debate around vowels, is that a lot of the history of writing is really wrapped up in nationalistic narratives. And so, for instance, it's like, and scholars also get wrapped up in these debates in the same ways, you know? And so the debate over whether or not Greeks, quote unquote, invented vowels, and even to a certain extent innovated them, is something that gets wrapped up in ideas of Greek nationalism or Greek genius, right? And it's an idea that classicists, that people who study Greeks, the Greek languages and cultures, are much more willing to believe and express than, for instance, people who study Phoenician. So people who study Phoenician will say, well, okay, maybe Phoenician didn't have the 5 vowels, but they had something called mater lectiones. It's like mother letters, where they would use like the aleph and sometimes the yod as kind of dummy. They'd kind of place them in the middle of words, and they would have a function really quite similar to vowels, right? So the aleph would be an a, and the yod would be an I. So, you know, scholars don't even kind of agree about this. And some of the reasons why they don't agree has to do with who you want to believe, or who you think maybe was a bit more clever.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Do it.
How do we know it's syllabary then?
Okay, so that's a great question. And generally speaking, there's a rule of thumb where alphabets have fewer signs or a smaller inventory of letters than syllabaries. So maybe somewhere in the realm of like 12 to 36 or 40 is sort of on that really high end. Syllabaries tend to have somewhere between the 40 and 120 range. This is just all broadly speaking. And then logographic writing systems tend to have more than 100 signs. And so Cypro-Minoan, although we don't have scholarly agreement over how many signs are in the Cypro-Minoan script, everyone agrees that the number is somewhere between, let's say, 60 and 90. It's kind of the current consensus, which I know is quite a large range, but that really puts it firmly in the syllabary range. And the other reason why we're pretty confident that Cypro-Minoan is a syllabary is that the script that was used and adapted from Cypro-Minoan in the Iron Age, often referred to as the Cypro-syllabic script or sometimes Cypro-Greek script, that's a syllabary. Mm-hmm. And we do know that the majority of those sign forms were borrowed and adapted from Cypro-Minoan. And for that reason, we think that there must at least be that type of typological relationship between them, where the mom, Cypro-Minoan, was a syllabary and the child, Cypro-syllabic.
Would there have been an overlap between the two scripts, Cypro-syllabic and Cypro-Minoan?
That's a really great question, and not one that we understand really well. And it's also not clear to what extent it's 100% accurate to sort of divide the scripts into two different things so neatly. So one way to just rephrase it would be to say, oh, Cypro-syllabic is an adaptation of Cypro-Minoan. So Cypro-Minoan goes into use somewhere in the 17th century, where it's really, really meagerly attested, and then it remains in use for another 600 years. So it starts to peter out. Its use starts to peter out maybe around 1000. We're all talking BCE, so before Christ, right? And the Cypro-syllabic script is attested from the 8th century to the around 300 BCE. So that's used for quite a long time. What's happening in those 300 intervening years from 1000 to 700, or I suppose 200 years, so 1800, is very much debated by scholars. So we have 30 inscriptions that date to that period. They're either found, all of them, in Kition, so in the east of the island, or at Paphos, so in the island southwest. And depending on which scholar you read or whose opinion you support, some people say that those inscriptions are Cypro-Minoan, and other people say that they're Cypro-syllabic. I tend to take the Solomonic route, I suppose, and say, if scholars, let's not divide the baby, if scholars who are really well educated, who have studied the material really seriously, can't agree on what label to give them, then perhaps the inscriptions that we're seeing from this 200-year period or so are just kind of transitional, neither sort of one thing or what becomes the other thing. And when we say, what is Cypro-syllabic, what's the thing in the 8th century that makes us so confident to call it something else? What we see is a reduction in the number of signs. So the Cypro-syllabic inventory has something like 55 signs at most. And then we see the use of the Cypro-syllabic script to write the Greek language for the first time.
Something we haven't actually spoken about, I was looking back at some of the questions that I asked you, and I wanted to make sure that we covered this. We actually didn't talk about when do we first see Cypro-Minoan, and how early can it confidently be traced, and also what does it coincide with? I mean, can we identify events, for example, that may reveal us to its, where it comes from and why it emerges in that period?
So it's really hard to talk about when we first see the Cypro-Minoan script, because we have very few early inscriptions, and very few of those early inscriptions are well dated. So the archaeological context is just not good enough to give us a very clear idea of when they're discovered. So The earliest Cypro-Minoan inscriptions are broadly dated to the LC1, so the late Cypriot 1 period, and that begins somewhere around 1650 BCE. In that LC1 period, so there's LC1A, and that's the earlier part of the period, and then there's LC1B, and that ends around 1450 BCE. So that's like a 200-year span. In that 200-year span, we have four Cypro-Minoan inscriptions, which is just a paltry amount of evidence to use to construct a really secure narrative of sort of what's going on with the script during that time period. The earliest Cypro-Minoan inscription is probably, or is, on a weaving tool, so something called a discoid loom weight. So this is something that you would hang from a string to give tension for your loom. So this is really fascinating. It was inscribed before firing, which means that the person who made the loom weight knew, A, that they were making a loom weight, and B, that they wanted it to be written on. So that really shows a nice plan. Another very early text that we have is this tablet. It's sometimes called CM, like Cypro-Minoan 0. And this tablet comes from Enkomi, and this tablet has to kind of come from this LC1 period and might even conceivably be earlier than this loom weight. But the tablet is not strictly written in Cypro-Minoan, which is fascinating. So basically, the tablet has 3 lines. Each of them is ruled, so it has a line underneath the signs. And I believe it has something like 24 signs. And a portion of them are clearly drawn from linear A, and then a portion of them are just kind of funky, but none of them looks like Cypro-Minoan. So this tablet might be evidence of a period of borrowing the linear A signs and then kind of like playing with them, you know, until you eventually produce something that is Cypro-Minoan. But the first thing that we can say is definitely Cypro-Minoan is this discoid loom weight. What is happening in the LC1? The LC1 is regarded sort of as this transitional period for sure. And sometimes the invention or secondary invention of writing on Cyprus during this LC1 period is thought to be a harbinger of some of the changes that happen, such as increased in urbanization and those types of things. But I think that's sort of an older narrative that associates the invention of writing with the consolidation of cities and then the administration that has to happen along sort of with, let's say, the growth of population. But I don't know if we necessarily have evidence for that with Cypro-Minoan. You know, there's 4 of these inscriptions. There's kind of on these funky objects. So a loom weight, you know, for sure is not, or probably not anyways, associated with administrative activity. On the other hand, one thing that we can say that's happening, and this is an innovation particular to the LC1 period, and this was observed by Julia Muti. She is the first person to really show that these discoid loom weights are introduced to Cyprus, perhaps from Crete or perhaps from the Cyclades, kind of somewhere in that area, during the LC1 period. And these discoid loom weights were used to produce a very particular type of fabric. So there was a technological innovation that went along with them. And so it could, or this really intriguing early inscription on this loom weight could show that there's maybe a connection between the introduction of those 2 technologies together, which I think is exciting.
Does this have to do with script transfer?
For sure. So script transfer is a general term that's used to describe when one script is adapted and changed for a new context, often to write a new language. And so we know that some sort of script transfer happens between linear A and Cypro-Minoan. So the linear A script is transformed and then adapted to a Cypriot context. And, you know, like I mentioned earlier, there's an open question to what degree that script transfer involved an intimate knowledge of linear A if it involved knowledge of the whole signery. So was this someone who had learned to write linear A on Crete in a context where they learned everything? Is this someone who was knowledgeable in the language that was used to record linear A or not? Like, those things we don't know. And there's some indications that perhaps there was limited knowledge of the sign inventory and the sound of signs. So we do believe quite clearly that at least 10 Cypro-Minoan signs had the same value as their linear A counterparts. And we know that because those 10 signs survive both in linear B, which is deciphered, and in Cypro-syllabic, which is deciphered. But beyond those 10, things get a little hairy. And that, combined with the fact that maybe only as many as 30 linear A signs are borrowed to create Cypro-Minoan, raises some questions about how kind of like intimate and how faithful that script transfer from linear A into Cypro-Minoan was. And perhaps there was a lot of creative adaptation that was part of that process.
Given that we can decipher linear B script, and we know most of it is record keeping, is it fair to assume that it's the same with Cypro-Minoan?
So there's a good reason to think that Cypro-Minoan is not used for record keeping. And there's a few reasons for that. One of the main reasons is that a very prominent feature of linear B, and one of the things that facilitated its decipherment, is the heavy use of what scholars refer to as ideograms. So what the ideograms were are signs that depicted, like the name suggests, perhaps like ideas, or oftentimes objects in the real world. So for instance, in linear B, you have an ideogram for sheep, you have an ideogram for man, woman, shield. The one that helped lead to the decipherment of linear B is tripod. And so often, but not always, the ideograms are drawn in a really schematic way where they represent the form of the object in the real world. So the tripod, looks like a vessel with 3 feet, for instance. Cypro-Minoan has no ideograms. It has no signs that look like they're drawings of objects in the real world. There's just really no correspondence whatsoever. So that's like one big reason why we're pretty sure that Cypro-Minoan is not inventory lists or other administrative documents. The other reason why we hypothesize that there are very few or no inventory lists in Cypro-Minoan is we don't really have very many numbers. So another thing, when you look at a linear B tablet, almost all of them have lines to represent ones or tens. So most of them sort of have lists, right? They're calculating something, and you can kind of see that in the layout, and you can see that in the signs that they use for numbers, which, kind of look to us like numbers even today. We were able to identify that that's what they were fairly quickly. So Cypro-Minoan, the number of documents, let's say there's a total of around 300 inscriptions. Scholars agree that 9 of them have numbers. Wild. So we don't even know. We know, for instance, that the number 5 is drawn with 5 vertical lines. But because Cypro-Minoan has vertical lines, uses vertical lines for word dividers, we don't even have an inscription where we know that the number 1 is written down, because we're not sure if what we're reading is a word divider or the number 1. We just assume that they're word dividers. So that would be the second reason why we kind of know that's not the case.
There's a quote here from your book, and you say that unlike most archival documents which were written on objects designed to be written on, Cypro-Minoan often appears on objects produced for other purposes, end quote. So I suspect this is probably the third reason. Can you then expand on this?
Yeah, 100%. So the third reason why we really believe that Cypro-Minoan was not, or at least the Cypro-Minoan that survives, was not used for inventory lists or administrative purposes, is that the majority of inscriptions are not written on corpus-made objects. So that's maybe a convoluted way of saying tablets. We have very few Cypro-Minoan inscriptions that are written on clay tablets. So we have 12 in total. And, when we see a clay tablet, we know that someone picked up that clay and made it into a specific form with the idea of writing on it, right? There's not a lot of other things that you can do with a clay tablet. But in the case of Cypro-Minoan, the majority of inscriptions, so around maybe 2/3, are on things like ceramic vessels or metal vessels or other types of objects that would have had other primary functions than to be writing surfaces. So the first example I gave you is clay vessels. And clay vessels are the most numerous Cypro-Minoan inscription types. So we have about 100 Cypro-Minoan inscriptions on clay vessels. A portion of these vessels we know are locally made. The vast majority are locally made vessels on Cyprus, but the inscriptions were added after the baking of the vessel. In other words, they weren't inscribed by the potter, or they weren't inscribed at the time of the vessel's production, but afterwards. So once the vessel had already gone out into the real world and done other things. And so because we have so very, a minimal number of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions on these purpose-made writing surfaces, we think, okay, it's probably not primarily a script used for archival or documentation or inventories. Now, I will kind of backtrack and say, when I said minimal, it's not quite true. We have about 1/3 of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions on purpose-made writing surfaces, but the biggest bulk of that are these little clay balls around 2 centimeters in diameter. So these things, they sit in the palm of your hand. And about 80 of our purpose-made writing media that we have Cypro-Minoan on are these little clay balls, and they carry very short inscriptions. And these two are, for sure not inventory lists. They may or may not have had a quasi-administrative function, and that's something we can talk about. So I think Pippa Steele, who you've had on your show, is that right, Philippa?
Yeah. She's the first person who I chatted with about these mysterious clay balls. Yeah, they were bizarre.
Yeah, amazing. They're super bizarre, for sure. They don't really have great analogs, as she's told you. I think she tends to adhere to the idea that, their function is maybe slightly more administrative in the sense of kind of standardized. So the balls are all similar sizes. They bear similar length inscriptions. And so whatever they're being used for, their function is quite, I suppose, agreed upon in the way that we maybe think of administration as being a kind of group activity that everyone's participating in and expects their documents to look a certain way. Right. So if you think about a receipt, like a business receipt, you kind of want that business receipt to follow a format that's more or less anticipated by its audience. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it does. There was something else we're going to explore definitely what we think, what scholars think was written on those, on the clay balls and any other objects. But what also caught my attention was that Cypro-Minoan texts written on objects recovered from the sea, such as tin and lead, both which are not indigenous to Cyprus. Does this suggest some sort of mercantile function? Do we have any guesses as to why they would be inscribed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the main frameworks that I use in the book is to say that Cypro-Minoan texts can be kind of grouped into one of those groups is texts that were written or used in mercantile contexts. And then the other is texts that were used within the island. And I just use the term insular to refer to those texts from the Latin insula, meaning island. So really the texts that remain on the island. And some of the most obvious and interesting mercantile texts we have are, you said, these ones that are found on metal ingots in shipwreck contexts, or I think in one case, a ship that just sunk to the bottom of the sea. not in a wreck, but just kind of where it's at. And so we have not a huge number of these texts, like 6, I believe, is the total number of things that are regarded as inscriptions proper. So 4 of them on tin ingots. And they really spark the imagination, right? Because, for instance, these 4 tin ingots are found off of the coast of modern-day Israel and Palestine. And we know, like you said, that tin is not coming from Cyprus itself. So this means that people with knowledge of the Cypro-Minoan script are taking this precious metal object, which is very important for the production of bronze, right, to mix with the copper that we do know comes from Cyprus. And they're writing on these objects, and we don't exactly know what for. But in all likelihood, the people who have access to them at sea are people who are involved in the overseas trade. And they're either writing on the ingots, perhaps for functional purposes, perhaps just to say, like, look, I'm the person in charge of circulating this metal, and look at me, I'm so awesome. We don't know exactly why, but for sure we know, okay, the script, 1, was used outside of the island of Cyprus itself in this instance, 2, on an object that comes from elsewhere, and then 3, related to overseas trade in some capacity.
That's really cool because, I guess it suggests that this script is, Eastern Mediterranean wide, not necessarily common language, but a common script that, whether you're on Cyprus or, across the sea, you're communicating with this script that is presumably indigenous to Cyprus, which is a pretty cool thing. I am biased because I am, History of Cyprus podcast, so I'm a little biased there.
I just wanted to add, so we do know that there are Cypro-Minoan inscriptions, aside from the shipwreck ones, that are found in places other than Cyprus. So we have around 12 inscriptions found at the site of Ugarit, which is in northern Syria, modern northern day Syria, which was a mercantile hub, like an urban center on the coast. And then we have a much smaller number of inscriptions, around 5, from Tiryns, Greece, so Tiryns. And so we know that there were people writing Cypro-Minoan outside of Cyprus. I think the open question, and one that people will debate quite heavily, is whether or not these are only Cypriots talking to Cypriots. So to what extent, is who's the audience, I suppose, is another way to say it. On the other hand, when you start to mark something like tin ingots, which are pretty large and pretty visible and are objects that are moving and circulating, maybe you are trying to make people see your script. And, some of the inscriptions I believe that we have from Ugarit especially really indicate that there are people at Ugarit who would have understood and known the script and even written it there.
Okay, so what do we suspect may have been written on them?
Sure. So in here, I think you're thinking of the balls in particular.
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. So yeah, there is a hypothesis that the balls especially, but also some other Cypro-Minoan inscriptions record names. And some people believe that they're personal names, so the names belonging to individuals. And I think other people, myself included, are maybe a bit more circumspect, so they might be divine names or perhaps even toponyms, so the names of places, although that's probably less likely. Why do we think they're names? There's 2 reasons. The first is probably cooler than the second. So the first reason that we think they're names is we have 82 of these balls on Cyprus written in the Cypro-Minoan script. And like I said, we put these in the insular framework. These are our insular bucket. But weirdly enough, we have 2 balls that are found at Ugarit, and they're not inscribed in the Cypro-Minoan script, but they're inscribed in the Ugaritic cuneiform alphabet that I mentioned earlier. And the 2 balls have inscriptions that are legible, so we can read them. And the best hypothesis for what the 2 balls say is that they record names. So one has the name Paganu written on it, and then the other is Shamanu. Now, the really crazy thing about the name Shamanu, and remember how we said that for the most part, Ugaritic, while it does have 3 kind of vowel signs, it doesn't usually employ them.
Mm-hmm.
So really what the ball says is sh-ma-na. And sh-ma-na is exactly the same word for, or are the 3 consonants that are used in the word for oil. So either we have a personal name or we have the word for oil, which unfortunately is just like the nature of archaeology, nothing's ever easy or straightforward. But in all likelihood, Paganu is almost certainly a name. And so the weight of the evidence is to say that those balls probably contain names. And then we infer, because the balls really look a lot like the ones that are made on Cyprus, similar size, the whole shebang, that the Cypriot ones, which are clearly the model for the Ugaritic ones, probably also contain names. And then the secondary reason why we think that the balls contain names is because some of the sequences on the balls are also on other objects, like metal bowls in one instance, an interesting kind of ivory object found in a ritual context from Kition. And so the kind of idea that these are words that are repeated on different types of objects makes names a kind of likely candidate, if that makes sense.
There are cylinder seals as well, which have Cypro-Minoan written on them. And I think these are kind of like outliers.
Yeah.
In what way are they outliers? What's unique about them?
So we have about like 20 Cypro-Minoan inscriptions on cylinder seals. And for those of your listeners who don't know what the cylinder seals are, is they are cylindrical stone objects. They are quite small, maybe like 1 to 3 centimeters in height, and quite thin. And they often have like decorative motifs or whole scenes inscribed into them. And they're often really quite beautiful and quite detailed. And we know, for instance, in the Near Eastern context, the cylinders would be rolled on clay, and that would be a kind of proof that the person who held the seal had approved whatever is going on in the thing that they stamped. So sometimes we have cylinder seals, for instance, marking tablets, which says, I've read the tablet and I'm a witness to it, for instance. Or other times we have seals that would have been on lumps of clay that would have been locking a door, that type of thing. And within the Near Eastern context, cylinder seals often bear inscriptions. They're usually kind of ritual prayers to a god. Sometimes they can reference the owner of the seal, so also contain names. And so on Cyprus, we have inscriptions, these 20 or so inscriptions on cylinder seals, but something weird is happening. Both with cylinder seals in general on Cyprus and with the inscription. So cylinder seals in general on Cyprus are something of a mystery because we don't have any evidence that the seals themselves were ever rolled on clay. So if the Near East is full of these tablets and these lumps of clay that have the rolled out cylinder seal impressions on them, and they're kind of everywhere, on Cyprus we have 1.5 that have ever been found. 1.5 pieces of clay with a cylinder seal impression on them. That's not, so it's kind of an open question. Were cylinder seals being used for a purpose other than a kind of administrative function? Or were they being used on a different material? So Joanna Smith, for instance, who has studied them extensively, suggests maybe that Cypriots just used a lot of wax. And then the other thing that's going on with them that's weird is that their texts are usually not really clear or readable. So every once in a while, the maker of the cylinder seal has cleared the surface and put the inscription in that kind of cleared off little portion. But often they were just kind of like shoving letters wherever they can fit, often not even in a row. Sometimes some letters are upside down and some are right side up. And so there's just not the standardization that you would anticipate or expect of the inscriptions themselves if they were meant to convey important information about the owner of the seal or the function of the inscription itself. So they're pretty cool.
Yeah. A lot of the stuff, it's a shame because Cyprus, I don't believe its environment lends itself to preserving a lot of materials. It's not like, I don't know, Egypt comes to mind, and its dry desert has the ability to just preserve stuff that comes down to us today. And I just wonder how much is lost.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, definitely we are not Egypt. Now, the thing I will say is that clay stays. If we were going to advertise, clay in the ancient world, we say clay stays. But the thing that doesn't stay, that stays in Egypt, and that occasionally we find that relates to writing practices is wooden writing boards. So one possibility is that the reason why we have only around 300 Cypro-Minoan inscriptions, but some of them are really the script is really kind of beautiful and well arranged, kind of indicating that people have been writing for a while and were very comfortable with writing, is that the script was used on materials that no longer survive. And one of the materials that we know, or a common writing medium that was used in the ancient world, are wooden writing boards. And so the idea would be that you take two pieces of wood and you attach them at the center with a hinge, kind of like a book, right? So you might have seen the word diptych before, like two wings.
Yeah. And I think of also a triptych as well, which is like it unfolds into three. Yeah.
Yes. And I think we know maybe like you can have a 12, a dodeca.
A dodecatic. That's wild. That sounds like unruly.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the wings must have been huge. And so basically what they would have done is they would have carved out, or we know they did this, you kind of carve out the inside portion. So you leave a margin on the outside, and then you fill that with wax. And essentially what you're writing on is the wax surface that you're impressing. And we know that sometimes the wax was colored, so it would allow for the impressions or the signs to kind of be made more clear. So you can see a difference in the color or the shading that would have popped out. Yeah, and we know that these were used in cuneiform contexts. They were especially common on Anatolia, so modern day Turkey. So the Hittites used a lot of wooden writing boards, we think. And then the Uluburun shipwreck, which some people think was manned by Cypriot sailors, or at least for sure came into contact with Cyprus. There was, in one of the Pithoi, a diptych was found. And so we can't read it, of course. And in fact, we know there were 3 diptychs on board, 2 of which survive. So that's kind of very tangential evidence for writing being on other surfaces. And then Yorgos Papasabas at the University of Cyprus has written an article where he argues, and I believe Joanna Smith also supports this, is that some of these these long metal narrow instruments that we have were writing styli. And so stylus is used to write specifically on these wax boards.
These diptychs, I think they were being used all the way up into the Roman period.
Oh, more than that, for sure. So we have exactly, if you're interested in the Roman world or sometimes in the Greek world, we have good images, nice artistic renderings of people holding these diptychs. I think one of them became popular on the internet because it was perceived to be a computer or an iPhone. There's those occasional memes and weird conspiracy theory.
Oh. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They're diptychs, but through the Middle Ages. So they were in use on continental Europe, at least, for a really long time. And they really only went out of the fashion, I think, maybe the 18th century or something.
Wow. See, I thought, okay, Roman period. And, then they kind of fizzled out, but all the way up into the 18th century. That's incredible.
Yes.
That's incredible. You differentiate between script and language. Can you explain the difference and how that matters for Cypro-Minoan?
Yeah, for sure. And this is a thing that matters for Cypro-Minoan, but also just understanding or talking about writing systems in general. And the way that it has particular relevance for Cypro-Minoan is the fact that Cypro-Minoan is undeciphered. And I think I even write this in the book. If one of the things that a reader of the book learns, if it's the only thing that a reader of the book learns from the book is to be able to differentiate in their mind language and script, I will have felt, a job well done. And just, the reason for that is just kind of simple, because I think the study of script is interesting and doesn't get enough attention. So if I can turn some people to be interested in scripts rather than language, I'll be happy. So what is the difference between the two? And this is just a kind of simplified definition or difference. But language is the spoken form of, language is spoken and script is written. So script is the material form that language can take. And it's not only that. So when we write, we're not always writing signs or letters that reflect spoken language. So think about punctuation. But by and large, that's a definition that we can work with. So script is the material form of a spoken language. And as such, it can be studied separately from language. So Cypro-Minoan is undeciphered, meaning we don't know the language or languages that the script records. But because we have the written form or the material form of the language inscribed into these 300 or so objects, we can study how the writing looks. We can study the type of materials that the script was written on. And in that way, we can begin to piece together clues about what the writing system was used for, who the writers were, who their friends were, and so on. And so for Cypro-Minoan, we don't know the language or languages that the script recorded, but we can still learn about the people behind the script.
One thing that got my attention, Cassie, is these single sign texts. And I want to read this quote from your book, because one thing I really enjoyed when reading your book is just the accessibility with the parallels that you kind of draw. Your quote kind of makes the point here. You write, "The single sign texts comprise a mix of script and non-script signs. Some texts with script signs probably record abbreviations of words, like the B on a Boston Red Sox cap. With others were more probably similar to McDonald's golden arches, sharing the shape of a script sign, but able to convey meaning regardless of whether its viewer could read its script. The non-script signs, for their part, were perhaps more akin to the Nike swoosh." So understandably, this caught my attention. So what does this imply, and what is this evidence of?
Yeah, so I grew up in New England, so I think I was obligated by birth to make a Boston Red Sox reference somewhere in the book.
What if I were to tell you I was a Yankees fan? No, I'm kidding. I'm not. I'm a Jays fan. I gotta rep the city. I'm from Toronto.
Oh, nice. Yeah, so basically we have more than probably 1,500 or even more single sign text, and the majority of them are on ceramic vessels, but they also occur sometimes on ingots or weights or other things. And exactly like you illustrated from the quote, some of them are script signs, some of them are non-script signs, some of them are really simple, just like a plus sign is one of the most popular ones. And we actually don't understand entirely what's going on with these signs, but we have good reason to believe, for instance, that they don't refer to the contents of the vessel. And we think that they don't refer to the contents of the vessel because the inventory of signs is just too large. So there are these vessels called Canaanite jars, for instance. Those have just an inventory of, like maybe 80 signs on them. So in all likelihood, this similar vessel that's used over a couple 100-year period was used to carry a much more finite set of things. We also don't think that they relate to where the vessel was found or where it was produced. And again, it's just because we don't have any patterns of seeing the same signs in the same places. And so the hypothesis that was developed by a scholar by the name of Nicole Hirschfeld, who I work quite closely with, she was the first one to really study these single sign texts in any depth, is that they refer back, or they could refer back rather, to the people who were distributing the vessels. And so in that way, you know, the analogies or the comparisons to advertising logos was sort of intentional to say that that might be one thing that they're doing, is maybe not marking a product as belonging to so-and-so a handler, but handlers being proud of or asserting their importance in the role of the circulation of these goods.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to say that in all likelihood, we probably have multiple systems that are coexisting, and we just haven't quite figured out, you know, how to differentiate them in a systematic way.
These are controversial, right?
Yes.
I mean, there is disagreement as to whether they represent the persistence of literacy.
Totally. And, you know, to my mind, I think that that debate is a little bit misguided, might be a little harsh, but I think it depends on, you know, what question you're asking or what you're interested in. So some people say when you find a single sign on a ceramic vessel, even though that sign is of the Cypro-Minoan script, because there's not a lot of information other than the sign itself on the ceramic vessel, you can't say that the person who wrote the sign knew the script, right? It might just be that they knew the mark in the same way that someone can draw the M of a McDonald's Golden Arches and not necessarily know how to write the Roman alphabet, right? It's just something you've seen many times, and it's sort of seared into your brain. However, we do have a couple of examples of single sign texts that are found with inscriptions that have the same sign. So, for instance, like the tin ingots we were talking about, the 4 tin ingots, they all have the same inscription. Let's just say AB. So they have, each of the 4 have the letters AB. Some of them have BA in that order, and others have AB. There's also found with them a tin ingot that only has the letter B. And when we can find these things together in these groups, you know, I think to me, it's the conclusion is that the person who made the single tin ingot with the B knew the script, right? It could have even been the same person who was responsible for the AB or BA ingots. That we don't need to say. But, you know, it's someone who's in that context and who's aware of what the sign signifies. And so we have enough, or in those rare and lucky instances where we have broader contextual information and have found single sign text next to inscriptions that have the same signs, you know, I think we can say really, really strongly that in those contexts, the single sign texts are made by people who are literate. And while we can't go through each of those 1,500 inscriptions one by one and say, oh, was this made by a literate person or not? What we can say is that the people who are making those ceramic vessel inscriptions, we can say, well, there are literate people who are making the document form, who are writing inscriptions. And then there are these single sign texts, which are written according to the same rules of formatting and so on. And so there's good reason to infer that these are people who are working in the same spheres, or even are the exact same people as the literate ones. Yeah, but you know, I think there's been a reluctance because, for a variety of reasons, there's been a reluctance to attribute or to say that the single sign texts are evidence of writing. But I think that's starting to change. I think in the last 20, 30 years, most scholarship is siding with the view that writing on late Bronze Age Cyprus was fairly widespread. We only have such a small number of inscriptions because the majority of writing must have been on something perishable.
Yeah,
I think that's the broad view now.
Yeah. I find it really interesting that Cypro-Minoan is at its peak at the collapse of the Bronze Age. And I kind of always wanted to know, like, why, how, when most other scripts are kind of fizzling out at this time, this is its peak. What allowed it to thrive?
Yeah, I think I'm with you on finding that so interesting. So I think the hypothesis of the book, or one of the strong arguments put forward in the book, is that the fact that the script was used in mercantile context is part of what allowed it to thrive during this tumultuous period. And, we call it collapse. I think and I call it a collapse in the book. A lot of scholarship is tending to use language more like the age of transformation, if you will. But one of the reasons why it's been called a collapse is because the major palatial centers and these important urban centers where the empires of their days were located are destroyed for various reasons. So some we think by earthquakes, some we think are, violently sacked, others maybe destroyed by fire in the aftermath of something like an earthquake. And so we think of Pylos on Greece, Ugarit, the city that I've been talking a lot about today, the Hittite capital of Hattusha. All of these kind of centers get destroyed. And when they get destroyed, their scripts go out of use. And that's because their scripts were largely being used for administrative purposes. And so Cyprus, which does not suffer the same destructions, there's some restructuring during this time period, but Cyprus kind of gets along pretty well and maintains a lot of its old ways of doing things, while other places don't, because its script wasn't so strictly tied to these administrative functions, perhaps. And there is this kind of continuity on Cyprus, its use of writing in these mercantile contexts, which the island keeps up during this time period, is what I think allows for the flourishing of the script during this period.
It's really interesting because you mentioned that the choice to use Cypro-Minoan at Ugarit could reflect that expression of mercantile identity and not an ethnic or national one. To quote from your book, it superseded otherwise other modes of identity like ethnicity. And you actually talk about one example, the House of Yabninu, in your book, which is really interesting to read about. Can you tell us about our friend Yabninu in Ugarit?
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to tell you about Yabninu. So Yabninu is a high official within, let's say, ruling classes of Ugarit. And we know Ugarit during this time period is a Hittite vassal, but it still has its own king and queen who then are in vassalage, let's say, to the Hittites. So it has its own kind of independent hierarchical structure going on. And Yabninu is one of the people who's high up within the administrative structure of Ugarit. And being high up in this structure at Ugarit gives you special powers, I suppose we could say. And one of those powers is the ability to trade, to conduct international trade, both sometimes on behalf of the king and queen, but also independently. So essentially to make one's own wealth through the relationship that you're building as a high official. And so Yabninu's house has been extensively excavated. And in fact, I think they're re-excavating parts of it today, even now. And what it shows is a man who had lots of connections with different parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. So he has some really wonderful Mycenaean craters that almost certainly he got through Cypriots, bringing them to him. He has some stuff from Egypt. He has a scribe. So we have lots of cuneiform writing from his house. And we know that he has a scribe that was probably from Assyria writing in his place. So he's just connected. And we know that in the letters, so referring to his activities, that he was involved in trade and quite internationally connected, but also in the material in his house. And he has, at minimum, 3 Cypro-Minoan inscriptions in his house. 2 of them are on clay tablets, and those tablets were found along with the other cuneiform tablets. So they weren't separated out. So that's super fascinating. And then the other document, Cypro-Minoan inscription that was found in this house is a pithos rim inscription. And that's really, really interesting because pithos rim inscriptions are a document form that's common on Cyprus and is not used hardly at all in cuneiform. So in the cuneiform writing systems, whether Ugaritic or Akkadian, so syllabographic cuneiform. So what this means is that a Cypriot way of writing and a Cypriot document form is present in his house. And its fine spot is sort of at the transition from the quote unquote public to the private part of the house, which is really fascinating. We don't know if that's where the pithos would have stood in real life, but it's interesting to think of Cypro-Minoan as something that was not only used in his house, but also potentially visible. And the use of Cypro-Minoan being part and parcel of his kind of international persona and mercantile connection.
Just continuing with Yabninu, I don't know if we can say this. He's not Cypriot. I mean, obviously we don't really know at the end of the day. We can't confidently make that. Perhaps we can't confidently make that conclusion. So the language, the script of Cypro-Minoan. Does this mean if it was found outside of Cyprus that it was taught outside of Cyprus? Would people have learned on the job? Is there any evidence of scribal schools? How was the script transmitted across the Eastern Mediterranean?
Yeah, those are great questions. And, unfortunately, we don't have too many answers to them. Although I think we can say with some confidence that Yabninu was at least not perceived by other people at Ugarit as being Cypriot. So, we do have a term that you sometimes see within the documents of Ugarit that refers to a person's ethnic identity. And we have a couple instances of someone being called like the Cypriot, essentially. And, we have nothing like that for Yabninu. And, no other information suggests that he was from elsewhere. And that makes it all the more interesting. One of the things that I find really useful in the idea of a document form is it does imply a community of writers, right? So people learn how to format the documents in the same way, how to make the documents, what types of materials to use, what type of writing implement to use, etc. And one of the fascinating things about the documents from the Cypro-Minoan inscriptions from Ugarit is that some, like the Pithos Rim, are Cypro-Minoan document forms and others aren't. So for instance, the clay tablets in Yabninu's house are different from one another in their formatting, in their clay color, in the dactys, so sort of the handwriting, if you will. And they're really different from the clay tablets from Cyprus. So what that suggests to me is that, some sort of creative adaptation is happening. And Philippa Steele has also made a similar argument, which has very much influenced my thinking on this question. So it does not necessarily appear that a strict scribal school education is happening, because if that was the case, you'd think that the inscriptions on Ugarit, all of them, would sort of strictly follow Cypro-Minoan document form rules. And that's not the case, strictly speaking. And the document forms that are the same as the ones on Cyprus, like the Pithos Rims, are kind of short texts, right? It's the clay tablets that really differ substantially.
Something that you hinted at the start of this interview, the colonial ideologies that permeate Cypro-Minoan and all sorts of scripts and languages. It's so bizarre to think that a dead script, could be so politically loaded. And the 20th century was a period of tumultuous ethnic tensions that impacted the excavations and the conclusions that were drawn, specifically about Cypro-Minoan. Can you talk to us a little bit about what those colonial ideologies were and where that kind of fits in with Cyprus?
Sure. And, as many of your listeners will know, those the colonial sort of attitude and agenda with respect to Cyprus, changed a lot from the late 19th century into the 20th century, and the Haban issues changed in the attitudes. And so I did want to mention very briefly the early kind of like 19th century aspect of this, and this is with regards to Arthur Evans and his decision to refer to the script as Cypro-Minoan. And for him, he really was, a European supremacist, I suppose. I don't know if that's the exact right language. Also, a white supremacist. So he had this idea that white skin, but also specifically being European, blessed you with certain advantages over the quote unquote other races or darker races. I mean, he was very much a racist and had an agenda of advertising and defending white or European genius over that of the Levant. And so one of his investments in terming the script Cypro-Minoan was to say that European writing was practiced on Cyprus and, in some sense, like superseding or contributing to the later alphabet that gets written in the Levant. So that's like that's sort of one place that writing gets caught up in these colonial narratives, right? And if you can kind of think about it, sometimes we talk about writing as a pillar of civilization, not a term I love, but that idea then gets enmeshed with a lot of ideas about who is civilized. And that was particularly true in the 19th century and, continued in scholarly debate for much longer than one would think appropriate. Now, in the 20th century, there was sort of a whole other debate happening about the role of Cypro-Minoan. And so one place that this debate manifested is with respect to the colonization, the quote unquote colonization of Cyprus by the Mycenaeans. And so, as any Greek Cypriot knows, and anyone who's spent time on Cyprus, there's a lot of Greek national ethnic identity, and this is tied up with a discourse about the island becoming Hellenized. And today, it's generally understood to be an Iron Age phenomenon. So taking place, let's say, in the 8th century, kind of around that time period where we start to have the first evidence for the Greek language spoken on Cyprus. During the middle of the 20th century, when some of the longest Cypro-Minoan inscriptions were discovered, and here I'm referring to the clay tablets, which weirdly enough were all discovered in the 1950s, more or less. The discourse was about whether or not the Greek colonization happened in the late Bronze Age. So for them, the kind of horizon of that event happening was pushed further back. So around 1200, this was the view of Porphyrios Dikeos, the great Cypriot archaeologist, and then Claude Schaeffer, who was a French archaeologist who dug at Enkomi and also at Ugarit. He saw the colonization of Cyprus by the Mycenaean Greeks happening earlier in the 1400s. And this led to a really bizarre situation. When the inscriptions the clay tablets from Enkomi were discovered in the 1950s. And you have to understand that Enkomi at this time period is being excavated both by Dikeos and by Schaeffer. They're excavating in different areas of the site. And each of them finds a clay tablet. And when you're the person who finds the clay tablet, you're allowed to make the first pronouncement about it, right? And so Dikeos finds this tablet, and he sends it to Michael Ventris, the person who you may know is responsible for the decipherment.
Linear being, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, him and Ventris, they kind of write up this short little note about their clay tablet, and they say like, oh, like this looks very, they call it like Achaean. So referring to the Achaean Greeks of the Odyssey, right? And they say like, visually, you look at this writing, and this is like Aegean writing. And then you have Schaeffer, who finds another tablet from Enkomi, and these two tablets are the same writing form. They have a lot of similarities, and in fact, the writing style of the two tablets is almost identical. So they have a really uniform paleography. And Schaeffer sees this, and he's like, the writing looks very cuneiform-like. It looks very Semitic. And for him, it's because in 1200, he wanted to say that you have Semites coming into Cyprus. And, I say he wanted to say, implying that he's reading the tablet in such a way to support his story. And I don't think that's what's happening in a conscious way. But what's really interesting and illuminating about this example is you have two scholars who are looking at really similar objects, and they're coming to more or less opposing, at least in the terms of the day, opposing conclusions about them, about where they come from. And part of the reason why that has to be is because scholars were as preoccupied with these questions about who's colonizing Cyprus, as anyone was who was living at that time, right? And so even if they're not consciously necessarily trying to weave a story that supports what they believe, it happens. It happens pretty naturally, despite our best efforts to be unbiased,
Cypriot archaeology has now shifted to a more Cypro-centric approach.
Yeah, for sure. And so, one thing that you can say, and I think should say about the tablets, who knows how biased I am by being, by the Cypro-centric approach, is that, in fact, their writing style is really peculiar to Cyprus. So the writing implement that was used on the tablets has to have something with a rounded tip. So neither cuneiform nor linear B or linear A is written with a rounded tipped stylus. The tablet and the way that the stylus must have been held must have been really kind of vertical, because you can see the angle, the kind of downward angle of a lot of the impression marks, which is really fascinating. So neither cuneiform nor linear A or B is kind of written in that manner. And I realized that I said impression marks. One of the things about the tablets that's for sure not seen in the linear scripts is that the signs were made by impressing, a mixture of impressing the stylus into the wet clay and also sometimes drawing elements into it. So all of those kind of features combined shows you a tablet that's really unique, a way of writing that's really unique within the broader context of writing practices, whether it be Aegean or Near Eastern. And I think in general, scholars today are trying to look at Cyprus on its own terms and to say, okay, what's Cyprus doing, or what does the material culture tell us about what's going on Cyprus? And then only secondarily looking outside of the island for comparisons, and not to ask where did so-and-so a practice come from, but rather, to illuminate, perhaps like in the case of this tablet, why is this unique? Why is this way of writing unique? Those types of questions.
What do we need for the decipherment of Cypro-Minoan, in hopefully the next couple decades?
Great question. So among the things that are really inhibiting the decipherment of Cypro-Minoan, probably the top one is that we have very few inscriptions that are long, so that have more than 100 signs. And, this makes sense both in terms of maybe like human processes and also computer processes. You need more data to analyze patterns in how the signs are used or dispersed across the documents, right? In other words, to identify the grammar that's underneath or that's being encoded in this script. Another thing that might be inhibiting decipherment efforts is the fact that those 5 inscriptions that we have that are longer than 100 signs may or may not record the same language. Some of the reasons why we think that they might not record the same language is that the patterns and how the signs are used seem very different from one tablet to another. So there's just like not a lot of things that are the same. And, by patterns or grammar, what I mean is, for instance, how in English we form a past tense with an ed ending. So you can look at a text of English, and if it's long enough, you're going to notice that ed appears at the end of a lot of words, right? And on our Cypro-Minoan documents, the ones that are long enough to start identifying patterns, they don't have a lot of elements that are in common. On the other hand, one of the common elements that a lot of the documents have is a sign that's often used in word final positions. It's CM23. So we give the signs numbers because we don't know the sounds that they represented. And so because we see that as a consistent feature in a lot of the longer text, maybe they are recording the same language, but the reason why they have dissimilar patterns to one another could be that they're just very different genres of writing. So if you think of a grocery list versus a poem versus a novel, they're going to use words in very different ways than one another. So the word selection, but also the grammar that they're employing will be pretty different. So a letter you write to someone is going to have a lot of verbs, whereas that grocery list is going to just be full of nouns. And, maybe something similar is happening there. And that's why we're not able to make a connection in the patterns.
Cassie, thank you so much for recording this. And
you're so welcome.
It was really enlightening. And there was so much that, this isn't something that's really talked about. Cypro-syllabary is kind of at the forefront of, of Cyprus's scripts, and Cypro-Minoan. I think many people would be surprised, even just to find out that an entirely different script predates Cypro-syllabic.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's how I feel about Cypro-Minoan. So I'm happy I got you excited about it as well.